Okay, good evening and welcome to the next in our series of webinars. My name is Julia, I'm from the WSET School London, and I'm just going to do a brief introduction before I pass you over to Nina. So I think many of you have been to these webinars already. We've been running a number of them while we're in lockdown in place of the normal events that we would be running at WSET School. But one thing this has allowed us to do is reach a much wider audience, so welcome from wherever in the world you happen to be. So tonight, obviously we're looking at Piemonte. Nina is one of the educators that we work with on our events at WSET School London. She does both the Burgundy and the Italian series. If you've ever had the good fortune to get to one of those, you'll know it's a good tasting, good night out. But tonight she's going to share with us all of her Piemonte knowledge for now. If I can ask you to keep the questions till the end, we'll have a bit of time to go through those afterwards. It'll just mean that she can get through all the information. But what I'll do is pass you over to her and she can introduce herself. Over to you.
Thank you, Julia. Welcome everybody. My name is obviously Nina Cerullo, because so on the screen. Hello to, I know that some people know me, so hello, nice for you to join us. And first of all, just got to apologise for the burgundy maps. I've already been told off by somebody for having burgundy maps behind me. They're too heavy to take off my wall. But I have got the Barolo Barbaresco maps next to me, and they're on the screen as well, so don't worry, they will be coming up. Yes, I do the Italian series up at the head office at WSET, and the Piemonte tasting is one of those. A lot of people know me also for Burgundy, but I also work with the École de Vin de Bordeaux, so bit of everywhere really. The Italian connection is actually my husband. I married an Italian, and for those of you who know Italians, you know that they are very passionate people, so you kind of don't have much choice. You get thrown into the culture and the food and the wine. And my husband's family are from Campania, which is obviously southwest of Italy, but in the last sort of 3 or 4 generations, they have all dispersed around the whole of Italy, which has given me over the years a lot of opportunity to sort of travel and get to know various places. He has a cousin who lives just in Torino, and we've been there many times. And I have to be honest, out of all the cousins, out of all the relatives that live all around Italy, because they are genuinely everywhere, the Torinese, the Piemontese, the people of this region, I would say, are perhaps the proudest of the Italians. They really are quite, we are the best. Sorry if you're Piemontese, and I don't mean to offend you, but they do very definitely have that sort of that opinion of where they are, their place, their towns, their cities, their wine, their food. It's the best. In fact, I remember this was years and years ago. And by the way, don't ever do this. We invited to dinner to owners of a restaurant which was not far from where I live, which at the time was in the top 100 restaurants in the UK. We invited the owners for dinner because we got to know them quite well. That was a big mistake in itself. The pressure was extraordinary. And they were both from Piemonte. And I very foolishly thought that because they drank Piemontese wine pretty much all the time, that they would like to have something different. So I gave them, I think we started off with some French bubbles, and then I moved on to California, and we had some California Cabernet Sauvignon. It was as if I'd just kind of slapped them in the face. They couldn't believe that I would do that. Why would I not give them Piemontese wine? So that kind of gives you a taste of, I think, a lot of the culture of Piemonte. Now, whenever I do these sessions up in London, a lot of people always say to me, the worst thing about your sessions, Nina, is that we always leave them absolutely starving, because I do tend to talk about food quite a lot. And I think if you're studying Italian wine, food is almost as important, if not more so, because unless you understand the culture and the food of the region, it makes the wines make sense, because they're so different, whether you're in the northwest, northeast, middle, south, wherever you are in Italy. The foods are so different and the wines are so different, the grape varieties are so different, and it's why I think a lot of students especially really struggle with Italy, because there are so many different grapes. And if you understand the culture and the food, it does really help you to understand the wines. So, I mean, for example, we're in Piemonte, and if I go back down to Campania, where my husband's family are from, we would be eating a piece of fresh fish with some vegetables, with some olive oil, tomato, garlic, maybe some mozzarella, but everything very fresh and light. Up here in Piemonte, we are eating pasta with ragu of wild boar, truffle, mushrooms, steak, lamb. That you would never see those down in Campania. And so when you look at the wines and you taste the wines, they all make sense, because you couldn't put a Barolo with a meal in Campania. It wouldn't work. It would destroy the food. And likewise, some of the wines from Campania would not work with the highly flavored foods that you find in Piemonte. So it's like getting to know the food is almost as important. So when we talk about the wines as this session goes on, try and bear in mind what you would eat with it. And I hope those of you that are actually tasting are going to be eating something with them, because especially those Barolos and Barbarescos, they're pretty tough to actually drink on their own. I always say they need food with them. Some of the whites you could drink on their own, but the reds can be difficult. Right, anyway, so I've talked enough about me, that's enough. Let's move on. So can we have the next slide, please, Julia? So just a bit of geography, because I'm sure most of you know where Piemonte is, but just in case you don't, you can see it's up there in the southwest, sorry, not in the southwest, that's somewhere else, right up in the northwest of the country. And you can see that in that big purple pink part, it has France to its west and Switzerland to its north. Now, the key factors really as to where it is, which has a massive impact on the climate there in Piemonte, is where it sits within those mountains. And if you have a look at that map, you can see that it's bordered to the north by the Alps, to the west by the Alps, and also to the south. So to the south of it, you have the tip of the Apennine Mountains, which are those mountains which run all the way up through the center of Italy, right from the very boot of Italy, right up through the center. And then they finish off in that little piece in Liguria, right at the top, just below Piemonte. That means that Piemonte is protected from three sides, and quite dramatically protected. So the only way that anything can really get through is from the east. And if you look, you can see that really broad valley. That's the Po Valley, the Po River, which runs right from the French Alps right through to the Adriatic Sea. So that is where everything, if anything, comes from. So just the fact that gives you an indication of what we're going to expect from the climate in Piemonte, because it has that protection. So you've got virtually no winds coming down from the north, because you're protected by the high Alps. You're protected from the winds from the west by the French Alps, and then you're also protected from the Mediterranean. So very little influence from Mediterranean, also from the south. So it is from the east that you get influences, the climatic influences. And just in that map on the left side of the screen, you can see there the principal areas of production. So you've got Barbera d'Asti, Barbaresco, Barolo, Asti, Alba, that's Roero in there. They are the Langhe Hills. There's also a lot of production further east and further north into the foothills of the Alps, which are really quite important as well. Small production zones, but still really very important. Okay, move on, please, Julia. So climate. So this is a really important factor in Piemontese wine, almost more than any other part of Italy, because it has a really strong effect on not just the wines, but on the grapes in particular. You know how I was saying before that the food and the culture is very important. These things haven't just happened, recently. We are talking centuries of trial and error, trying grapes out. They don't work. Grapes have mutated to fit the climate, to fit the temperatures. People have chosen to plant certain grapes because they prefer them with their foods, etc. This is no accident. So the grapes that are grown here really fit very nicely in with the climate that we have here. And in fact, Nebbiola, for example, which is perhaps the principal, we call the principal grape. It's not the most grown grape, but it's the principal one. It doesn't grow particularly well in many other parts of the world. It's been trialed elsewhere, but it really helps to have exactly what is here to make it at its best. So like I was saying, the Alps create that natural barrier from the north and the west, and they also create a rain shadow. So the summers in Piemonte are really quite dry. To the south, obviously, we're protected from the Mediterranean, so there's very little Mediterranean influence. If you consider that we are on the same latitude as Bordeaux, and yet Bordeaux can be really quite wet, and the winters in Bordeaux are really quite warm, and yet here in Piemonte, because of that protection from all sides, it can get really very cold. In the summer, because we are continental climate here, because we have this protection, in the daytime, yeah, it can get really hot, but at night, especially at altitude, at some of those vineyards where we have Barolo and Barbaresco, it can get really very cold, even during the summer. So the continental climate is a big important factor for ripening the grapes. We'll talk about it more later, but Nebbiola, for example, is one of the longest ripening grapes. It's one of the earliest bud, as far as grape varieties are concerned, and it's one of the last to ripen. So you have to have a season of very long, hot, sunny days for that to happen. There is one other factor, though, which does put a spanner in the works, and that is fog. So you remember the map where you had the Po Valley coming in all the way from the Adriatic? Basically, the winds and the moisture come in that way. They come in from the Adriatic and they pick up more moisture with the Po Valley, and they reach Piemonte and they stop because there's nowhere for them to go. So they stay there sitting over the vineyards. Now that is an important factor because over centuries, the grapes that grow here have to be able to ripen either before the fogs come in, and it tends to be early autumn that they start to arrive, late summer, early autumn, but they also have to be able to continue ripening with those with that fog there. And that is why it is so important that we have grape varieties that can actually do that. And of course, we'll talk about it more later, but Nebbiola, the great Nebbiola, the name Nebbia. So this is a grape which will happily ripen with the fog. Okay, so they need to be tough grapes. And the thick skin of the Nebbiola grape allows it to put up with the fog, the disease that the fog might bring, and still allow it to ripen, but it's one of the things that gives the character of Barolo and Barbaresco. Okay, Julia, please, if you move on, thanks. Okay, so talking of grape varieties, so is anybody out there drinking a Moscato d'Asti while I'm talking? I was really hoping somebody would be. This is Moscato Bianco. For those of you who have never had any, or who just look at it and think, oh, it's what you give to your teenage children, or to your children, trust me, okay, when I do these sessions, normally one of the best things about these sessions is that we get to taste some pretty stunning wines. And one of the lovely things about doing these Italian series for the WSET is that they give me pretty much free rein to taste whatever I choose, and then they price the sessions accordingly. And so we do have some really quite nice wines. A couple of years ago, I included in the tasting an Asti Spumanti, and I was amazed that in the room, I think there were 24 people, not a single person in that room had ever tasted Asti Spumanti. So this is your homework, okay? Because you can't actually taste all these wines, but I'm going to give you a couple of pieces of homework. I do give really good homework, okay? So your homework is to go and purchase at some point, not right now, a bottle of Asti Spumante or Moscato d'Asti and taste them, because they are such a treat. They are really beautiful, beautiful wines and hugely undervalued. I don't know why we don't drink more of them. We don't drink more of them because they're not fashionable, I think, although it is still the highest selling sparkling wine in Italy. So, and most of it is exported, so I'm not sure where it all goes. But so these are Asti Spumante. They're gently sparkling. They're not sort of really ultra fizzy. And Moscato d'Asti is even more gently sparkling. So don't expect sort of fizz bomb. They're beautiful sort of on an evening like tonight, so really warm and sunny. A glass of Asti Spumante. It's just gently sweet. They're not sticky sweet. And they have this lovely freshness to them and this sparkling. Also, if you've got a fruit salad or something for after dinner, they go really well with a light dessert or a sort of a pandoro or sort of like a light cake. and a glass of Asti Spumante. It's just divine. So homework, you've got to go and try some. Okay, moving on to Cortese. Okay, I have to be a little bit careful because this is being recorded, but I'm not a huge fan, I have to be honest. Cortese Gavi, as you can see, I've written relatively neutral in character. I've often wondered why it was so successful, and I think there are a couple of reasons. A, the name, Gavi is a very easy name to remember, and a lot of Italian wines are not easy to remember. And I once spoke to a sommelier and asked him, why is it so popular? And he said, because it tastes of nothing. And actually, some wines which have very little flavour, because they won't offend in any way, do very well. A little bit like Pinot Grigio from the plains, you know, they are very successful because there's nothing about them which offends in particular. So Gavi del Comune di Gavi, so this is another step up in quality. So the Cortese grape, but grown in the Comune di Gavi, this is the Classico region. So that's the steeper slopes sitting around the old town. They are quite different. So they're much riper grapes and they make a riper, fuller wine with more flavour. Okay, so if you're going to drink Gavi, then drink Gavi di Gavi. It's usually only £1 or £2 more a bottle, and the difference is huge. Okay, so okay, I've been nasty to it, so I apologise to all you Gavi producers. But for me, at the moment, the next grape is the one that's really interesting. So this is your second piece of homework. If you haven't tasted Arneis, this is a wine that you really need to try, because it's such a it does everything. It's such a lovely wine. It has lovely flavors. It's really fresh. It has great acidity, great with food, but it's also lovely to drink on its own because it does have a lot of flavor, and it has this lovely zesty finish to it. I just think it's an absolute delight, and for me, it is the white wine of Piemonte at the moment. I think this is the one that we should be really focusing on. As you can see, I have kind of done that. So that's your homework, to go and drink. Oh, somebody's just written something. Just bought some. Well done, well done. I like that. Yes, good choice, good choice. And the other grape to note is Favorita, the grape at the bottom. Vermentino. Now, I'm a big fan of Vermentino. I love it from wherever it seems to come from, whether it's southwest France, southeast France, southwest France, whether it's Sardinia or whether it's Tuscan coast. I just really like it. And this is no exception, actually. I really like Favorita in Piemonte. Unfortunately, I haven't seen much of it yet for sale in the UK. I don't know how well it does in other countries around the world, but keep your eyes open for it, because I think with the way we drink wine these days and the foods that we tend to eat, the sort of modern style of eating, I think Vermentino Favorita goes really well with it. Goes really well with Asian food because it has this nice sort of spicy character to it, and it's quite exotic. So it goes very well with Asian food, but it's also lovely with fish and, well, pretty much anything. I just really enjoy it. It's a really enjoyable wine. Please move on, please. Thank you. Right, so red varieties. Obviously, Nebbiola is the one that people think of when they think of Piemonte, but we mustn't forget the others because they are extremely important, more so now than I think they used to be. Barbera is the most planted grape in Piemonte. It used to be, when I say used to be, quite a while ago, but still is in some places, a bit of a workhorse grape. So it's a grape that's grown for making, if I dare use the word, plonk. However, in more recent years, I'd say in the last 10, 15, 20 years, there's been a real movement to producing Barbera of real quality. And actually with modern winemaking, with management in the vineyard, and I hate to say it because it isn't good for everybody, but global warming, Barbera has actually started and does produce some really super wines, ranging right from easy drinking. In fact, I've got one downstairs actually, but it's something that I want to have food with, so I didn't open it. But some really easy drinking Barbera d'Asti, the Barbera d'Alba, right through to sort of really super high quality wines where the vines have been really stressed, green harvesting, oak fermentation, oak maturation, just really seriously good, to the point where they can very easily sort of go up against top Barolo and Barbaresco. So I can't stress enough how good some Barbaras can actually be. One of the problems it's always had as a grape variety has been its acidity levels. So it's not a particularly tannic grape, and in fact historically it was often blended with Nebbiola because Nebbiola has such high tannins. One of the ways they would actually bring some of the tannins down in some of the Nebbiola wines in Piemonte was to add some Barbera, because the tannins were so low, so it would just balance it out. And in fact, there have been, over the years, several Barolo producers which have tried to get a sort of 10% of the blend in Barolo to be an addition of another grape, like Barbera or Dolcetto or Cabernet Sauvignon or something, to actually try and balance the Nebbiola, but it has been denied every time. But Barbera now is a seriously good wine, and I don't want to give you too much homework. But one of the nice things about Barbera d'Alba, Barberasti, is even the really sort of lower end price wines are seriously good now. It's actually really quite hard to turn up at a restaurant in anywhere in Piemonte, sit down and have a really basic bottle of Barbera and it not be good, because of what we can do in the vineyard and what we can do in the winery. So please don't dismiss it and think it's got to be Nebbiola, because you may be seriously very, very happily surprised if you try some of the Barberas. And because Nebbiola tends to be at the moment, and prices are growing on it, it's leaving Barbera behind a little bit. So it's actually a nice way to taste wines of the region without breaking the bank. Dolcetto, the little sweet one. So has anybody had Dolcetto? It's one of those things that I tend not to drink it when I'm here in the UK, unless I'm doing tastings. But when I'm in Piemonte, especially in Torino, we drink loads of Dolcetto. So if you go to a restaurant and you sit down and they bring a carafe of wine, that's what it is. You know, if you don't ask, we'll just have a carafe of your house red. Chances are it'll be a Dolcetto, because it's very easy to drink. It has low acidity, so you don't need to be eating something, you know, really oily with it. You can actually just sit down and drink a glass of red wine. The grape is actually so sweet that a lot of Dolcetto grapes are actually eaten as table grapes, because they are so sweet and flavoursome. So if you can imagine that put into a wine, you can imagine that they can be really soft, light, fruity, easy drinking wines. There are a couple of exceptions. I can see it there on the screen. Dolcetto di Dogliani is now a DOCG, and they do take the whole thing much more seriously. They can sometimes be a little bit almost New World in style, I suppose, really quite big and bold and New Worldy, and almost not Piemontese a little bit. I think that's the only, not criticism, but maybe a little bit of a judgment. I think they go out of their character a little bit, but they're lovely, sort of enjoyable wines, Dolcetto. So if you haven't had one, look out for them, because they're nice. Another one that's on there at the bottom, Bracchetto. That's Bracchetto, Freisa and Grignolino are three traditional grapes which we are seeing less and less of now, because if you've got a vineyard and you can sell a Nebbiola d'Alba for 15 euros a bottle, why would you keep your Freisa, which you can only sell for 6? So there has been a lot of pulling up of traditional varieties and replanting with Nebbiola, which I don't know, it is a shame. But Bracchetto d'Acqui, if you haven't had one, is interesting because it's slightly sweet and it's sparkling. So it's something that you often find again in Torino or around in Piemonte. Can we move on, please, Julia? Okay, so Nebbiola. So this is the one that most people are probably most interested in, and several of you are actually drinking as we speak. And as I mentioned at the beginning, nebbia, meaning fog, is where the grape's name comes from. Whether it comes from the fact that it can actually put up with growing in fog, or whether some people say it comes from that bloom that is actually, you can see it there on the picture, the bloom that's actually on the grape, they call it a nebbia. So whether or not they call it Nebbiola because of the bloom, or whether because it actually will quite happily ripen slowly with foggy conditions, who knows, one or the other. But yes, it can. And one of the reasons for this is its extremely thick skin. Now, obviously, having a very thick skin brings complications, because thick skins mean high tannins, high acidity and high tannins. And of course, high tannins mean for you to be able to drink these wines, you need to age them. Now, I don't want to sort of dismiss that completely, but things have changed. So if we were drinking a Nebbiola from 30 years ago, wherever you were within Piemonte, it would be a very different wine to how it is today. Global warming has had a big impact on the vineyards of Piemonte. So we used to pick, going back 20, 30 years, we used to pick Nebbiola in Piemonte, probably late October through into November, and sometimes towards the middle of November. Now, by then, the fogs were well and truly set in, and they were settled. So we would often pick Nebbiola underripe. Now, the problem with that, of course, is you have a thick skin and unripe tannins. So to get the flavor from those grapes, because they were underripe, you would have to use a lot of extraction. Now, during the making of the wine with a lot of extraction, all those tannins and that acidity, you would need years for that wine to actually, for the tannins to soften and for everything to work together. Unfortunately, by the time that happened, often the flavor had disappeared. So there's a reason why Nebbiola has become more fashionable, I think, in more recent years, is because actually global warming has allowed the grape to blossom. And not just in Barolo and Barbaresco, but in the other areas around, in the Langhe, in Roero, up in Gemme, in Gattinara. They are almost always now picked ripe, and almost always in October, if not early October, and sometimes late September in the riper spots. So they are picked when the skins are still thick, but if you're picking a grape which has got thick skins, if the tannins in there are ripe when you pick them, you don't need a lot of extraction in the winery. So you can have gentle maceration. So you don't end up with a wine with really high tannin. So in fact, you don't need to age them for so long before you get to drink them. So it's like a plus, plus, plus. And it has really helped Nebbiola. Sadly, it's not helped everything, but it has helped Nebbiola. And there have been some years when it's worked against them. For example, they've seen an increase in hail in Piemonte because of global warming, and that can be disastrous. And an increase in sort of extreme rainfall, which in something like 2002, when it pretty much washed away half of the Nebbiola vines. So there have been some disastrous years, but in general, it's been good for the grape. It's been good for us Nebbiola lovers, for sure. So one of the other things that we're doing to help it ripen earlier, other than the fact the climate has helped that, is a lot of green harvesting and de-leafing, so exposing the grape to the sun earlier. Now you can do that more on the steeper slopes, because you'll get more sun, obviously, if you're on a steeper slope. So, but having said that, the lower lying areas, which used to be considered not really suitable for Nebbiola because the fog would come in and they wouldn't ripen, they would have been planted with Barbera or Dolcetto, which ripen earlier. They can now be planted with Nebbiola. So, which is why I think a few of you I saw, you were drinking Nebbiola di Langhe, etc. Now the Langhe, the lower Langhe hills now, the Nebbiola almost always ripens. So don't feel that if you like the grape, you have to buy Barolo and Barbaresco. I would almost say they are getting so expensive now, to the point where it's kind of, oh my God, you know, and why not? Why wouldn't you? But it's worth trying the other Nebbiola areas. And also, one thing at the end of this presentation, there is a vintage chart, so you can see which have been the better vintages for Barolo and Barbaresco. But those hotter vintages are often, they are the vintages to buy the Nebbiolas from these outer lying areas. Somebody talking to their children. They can join in. Okay, so we've got thick skins, high tannins, and high acidity, and high alcohol, and it's getting higher, of course, because we are picking our grapes riper than we used to. And even despite what I just said, they do benefit from a bit of age. Even those which are growing on the lower lying areas, which are softer, or something like a Gattinara or Gemme, Carema, those wines, although they tend to be lighter and a little bit more elegant than the bigger wines of Barolo and Barbaresco, they still benefit from aging. And one of the reasons is the perfume that comes into Nebbiola wines after some age. So when they're young, they have much more primary fruit, and they have a little bit of spice, but it's all taken up by the tannin. So it's quite difficult to get over that. A lot of producers will use new oak to try and help soften the wines early, but of course new oak will cover up the aromatics of the Nebbiola grape. So again, it still helps if you can give it a little bit of time. I noticed that somebody was drinking a 2015 Rocco dell'Annunziata. I'm sure that's delicious, but if you could have left it for 3, 4, 5 more years, I think you would have benefited. You would have tasted more of the aromas rather than sort of just the structure. Although I'd be quite interested to hear your tasting note at the end of that, those of you that were drinking that. Okay, Julia, sorry, thank you. So yes, Barbaresco. Now, before I start talking about it, I just wanted to make a point. Yes, I've got the Burgundy maps behind me, so sorry again. But just to say, I have got, okay, the Barbaresco map. Obviously, I can't just stick it in front of the screen. So if you are interested in really getting to know the crew of Barolo and Barbaresco, you can get those maps and print them off. Quite legitimately, you're allowed to do that from the consortium of Barolo and Barbaresco. And I think it might actually be, I think the address is actually on the next page. So, so Julie, would you just move it forward a sec? So yeah, the bottom that's the langevini.it. So you can go to the consortium and print off those maps. So you can print them off as, I'm sure you can print them off as big as you like. If you really want to get to know the crew system of Barolo and Barbaresco. Can you go back, please, Julia? Thank you. So obviously Barbaresco, 100% Nebbiola. And like I said, along with Barolo, there have been some producers over the years that would like that changed so that they could allow to put in a little bit of something else just to help them out because Nebbiola can be tricky. But it keeps being denied, which I think is a good thing. Because one of the things that we have seen more recently is the growing of the cru system. So rather than just drinking Barbaresco, you're actually drinking Barbaresco from a single vineyard, and they are being recognized more and more. And of course, if we start adding different grape varieties, then you will not be able to feel the differences between one site and another. That's one of the lovely things. You've already got the differences of winemaking. So adding another grape, I think personally would be a mistake, but I know that there are several winemakers who disagree with me. So Barbaresco has to be aged in 26 months, and 9 of those have to be in wood, 4 years for Reserva. The soils here in Barbaresco are Teutonian calcareous clay. Some people call it calcareous marl. The key factor here is that they are very similar soils those that are found in Barolo and La Mora. Now, when we go to the Barolo map, it is divided into several areas. And 2 of those areas, Barolo and La Mora, have the same kind of soils that we find here in Barbaresco. Now, the point about that, which the important point, is that those soils help with maturity of the grape. So the wines that come from the Teutonian calcareous marls and clays are softer when they are mature. So when the wines they're mature earlier, sorry. So Barbaresco does mature. It is earlier drinking than Barolo in general. Okay, not every single one, but in general, it is a generalization. They are earlier drinking than most of the wines from Barolo. But there are some exceptions to that, because we have got some sites in Barbaresco which are now considered to be as good, finer, some of the best sites for winemaking anywhere in the world. So don't assume that it's kind of plays second fiddle to Barolo, because I think it used to, but it no longer does. I think in general, we think in the trade with very much a kind of a appreciation for the work that they have done in Barbaresco to bring it up to the same level and reputation that you would find in Barolo. And Angelo Gaia, there's a note on him there on the screen. Absolutely, he is God as far as Barbaresco is concerned. And I don't know if anybody who's listening in has been to the Italian icons tasting up at Bermondsey Street, but that's a really good tasting. I get to taste all. I get to choose the wines, and Gaia's in there, as is Bruno Giacosa. So they are both icons. So I mean, he really is quite iconic. He has changed the face of Barbaresco pretty much single-handedly, in that he made everybody look at it in a completely different way. Interestingly, Gaia is one of those producers that his Barbarescos are often not Barbaresco because he adds other grape varieties into them. So they often have other names, and they're just Languedoc because he adds a bit of this and a bit of that into them. But they're still absolutely delicious. It does have to be said, and I'll forgive him for that. Just looking at the flavors that you get and the aromas that you get in there, they are very, very similar to those that you find in Barolo. I think the difference is often the structures that you find in some Barolo wines. There are very few Barbaresco wines that have the power and the structure that you find in some of the Barolo wines. So that really is the main difference. But don't dismiss them at all. They're just delicious. There's somebody drinking some. Oh. Okay, so I'll read all those later. Okay, can we move on, please, Julia? So just having a look, so for those of you who really want to get to know the crew of Barbaresco, you can, like I said, you can pick up these maps, and you can read all about them on the consortium website. This was just because we have now started to sell Barolo and Barbaresco as single vineyard wines. It always used to be a case that you would have producers would just produce their Barbaresco. They might have a Barbaresco with a name, but in general, most producers used to take grapes from one vineyard and another and blend them together to make the best of what they could. With modern winemaking now and with vineyard management, we recognize that we can do things differently, and we can treat our vines differently depending on the soils and the site and the situation. And so there is now much more focus on single vineyard wines in Barolo and Barbaresco, to the point where relatively recently they decided to name each of the sites within the Barolo and Barbaresco zones. So they all now, well, they call them cru. For those of you who are interested in Italy, they're not called, we want them to call them cru. We wish they would just call them cru because it's really easy to say. And in fact, that's what everybody actually says. But on the website, you will see it says menzione, which means cru, geografica aggiuntiva. There you go. I mean, okay, I'm sorry, Barolo and Barbaresco, but that really is a mouthful. And cru would work really well. But we'll see. It just makes it a little bit different. So mega, it can kind of make it into menzione geografica aggiuntiva. It sort of shortens to mega, but people still tend to refer them to as cru. And you'll find that there's a lot of talk about whether or not we should start giving these cru a classification. So because some of them are clearly better than others. So just like we have in Burgundy, whether or not we should start giving some of the cru a Grand Cru status or Grande Cru, I don't know, here in Barolo and Barbaresco. And just for those of you who are really interested, I've put those there on the screen, which to sort of indicate some of the best sites. But on the map, Julie, if you could just run the mouse down from Secondini, which is kind of in the middle there, and it goes down in a southeast line, and that kind of little, yeah, sort of down there and slightly south, that tends to be the area where we find the best menzione in Barbaresco. So it's not exact because there are some others dotted around, but if you really want to get to know them, then you can pick up these maps. Okay, could you move on, please, Julia? Thanks. Barolo. Don't we all just love a glass of Barolo? I bet, I might be wrong, but I suspect that not many of you drink Barolo very regularly. It has really gone quite mad as far as price is concerned, and the single vineyards have pushed the prices even higher. Having said that, I can't blame them. It's actually really nice that they are being taken seriously, because Nebbiola is a tricky grape to grow, and it's a tricky grape to make good wine from. So the effort that goes into making them, you kind of think, okay, it's worth it. And if you have been lucky enough to taste some of the top Barolos and Barbarescos, especially with some age, it all makes sense. You understand why they are so expensive. I mean, if you compare some of the top Barolos, I think I'm just looking at the one that the last Barolo that we tasted last year for this particular session in London was Roberto Vercio's Barolo Cerqueira from 2007. It was £265, but and they are very good to me. It was, my tasting notes are, I could just read you the tasting notes. Okay, this is, so it was only a 10, 11-year-old wine, so really quite young actually. But Barolo Cerqueira is one of those that you can drink a little bit earlier. But my tasting note for this was a scent of sweet red fruit, white flowers, scented roses, dried roses, rich and powerful on the palate, seductive. I don't know where I got that from, but I've put seductive, creamy and broad, quite dark and brooding. So I mean, it just had so much. I've got leather, spice, licorice, tar, menthol, and sort of like squished cherries. I've written. It's like, yeah, you know, you write your own tasting notes and they always sound a little bit weird. But it just, I reckon I could have written more and more and more. It was just one of those wines which had just developed into something quite beautiful. And I wonder if that's what you're paying for, is that complexity that comes with aging a Barolo or a Barbaresco wine. The complexities are just, they really do pay off. And I would love to have tried that wine in another 5 years' time, Julia. Okay. I was rather hoping that maybe that WSET bought a case of it and we could try it again every 2 or 3 years. You never know. Anyway. So Barolo, obviously again, 100% Nebbiola. One of the reasons why Barolo has more structure is because the vineyards especially the top vineyards, are higher and cooler than those that we find in Barbaresco. So the Barbaresco vineyards are warmer in general. So the grape ripens a little bit earlier, which is why historically they have been easier to drink earlier, because we have a riper grape. And of course, historically, a lot of Barolo had to be left for such a long time to soften those tannins. But of course, as you now know, that's not necessarily the case so much anymore. They still need the time, but not like they used to. Now, can we just move on a slide? I'll come back to this one, but I just wanted to show, I like this, this map that's here on the left, because it just gives you an idea, for those of you who are not really sort of key about how things are in Barolo, because now that everything is no longer just put into one bottle, Barolo, which is how it used to be, now things are being separated, and you're starting to notice on labels things like La Morra, Barolo, Novello, Castellone Falletto. It helps to understand a little bit what they mean. So if you are lucky enough to be able to buy Barolo relatively regularly, or if you've got some in your cellar or under your stairs or what have you, understanding the difference between those regions can be really useful. And when I mean useful, I mean really useful. We're talking 5, 10, 20 years difference useful. So what you can see there, it's just divided, and this is pretty simple, but it is a lot more complicated this in real life. But that's just a simplified version of the difference of the soils that we have in the Barolo vineyards. And you can see that La Morra and Barolo are principally this blue-white Tortonian clay, okay? And on the other side, yes, we still have that Tortonian calcareous clay, but you also have some sandstone and some limestone and some other soils which make the wines very different. So the key here, when I was learning about Barolo, a long time ago, I had this little method of remembering which was which one was going to mature before the other. And it was quite simple. Serra Lunga, which is that area to the right, I remember lunga meaning long, because that's what it means. You need to age those for a long time. They are the longest. Okay, drinking Serra Lunga Barolo before it's 10 years old you're just missing out. So honestly, 10, 15, 20 for the top crew, 30 years for Serra Lunga Barolos. Monforte, forte meaning strong. Again, these wines need time to soften, okay? And on the other side, we've got La Morra and Barolo. Both of those words are just soft and lovely. La Morra, Barolo. So they are wines that you can actually drink earlier because they come out from the very beginning. They come out soft, more feminine. I know I'm not supposed to say that because you can get some very feminine men. It just, you know, they are softer and more gentle right from the very beginning. In the middle, you've got Castiglione Falletto. There's a lot of wine. So the three main production areas are La Morra, Barolo, and Castiglione Falletto. Castiglione Falletto, you can see, has a mix of both. So they're one of the most balanced areas for Barolo production. And you'll often find that producers will blend a little bit of one side of the area with some grapes from the other side of the area to make a much more balanced wine. But it's just a generalization, but it might just help some of you to work out what you should be doing with what you've got in your cellars or under your stairs, or with maybe even with a wine society or something. Oh, can we go back, please, Julia? So just to go over that again, and you can see Canubi, that's Barolo's most famous vineyard. You can see that sort of blue tinted calcareous clay marl there on there. That's the kind of color, and it's quite funny when you're there, when you're in the region, you look around and you just see these white patches all over the place. It's quite beautiful scenery, actually, the vineyards of Barolo, because of the terra bianca, as they call it. And like I put there, Barolo, I've just put it there, you can see I'm just repeating myself. So for the regulations for Barolo, we've got at least 2 years in oak and at least 1 year in the bottle prior to release, Reserva 5, at least 3 in oak, and they are needed. Okay, it's a good job that they do that. And in fact, a lot of top producers hold on to them for a lot longer than that before they release them. So you'll often find that the top producers won't even release them until they're, 10 years old, because they don't want you to drink them until they are at least approachable. Rich, deeply concentrated. I mean, I gave you that tasting note from the wine we had last year, and you can see the common aromas. One of the interesting things is if you ever get a Barolo in a blind tasting, if you're ever doing an exam, I'm not suggesting this is going to happen, promise, but if you ever do get a blind tasting and you get a wine in exam and it's pale, because Nebbiola is never opaque, you can always see through it, always. And with age, it takes on similar colors to Pinot Noir. So as they start to age, they take on very similar colors. So looking at it, you would look and you go, okay, straight away, it's Pinot Noir, it's Nebbiola, because they just have this particular color and density straight away. The difference is the nose. The nose on a Nebbiola, if it is, especially if you've got some of those aged tones in the color, you will very likely not pick up much fruit on the nose. You may get some dried fruit, but most likely you will get things like, and I know people talk about Barolo and they say tar and roses, but you really do get tar and roses and truffle and mushrooms and licorice and mint and things that you wouldn't expect to get. Now that to me is always a giveaway in a blind tasting. You think, what else could this be other than Nebbiola? And I know that I'm now going to get several little boxes which are going to say, oh, it could be this and it could be that, which is absolutely fine. But we're seeing more and more fruit now than we used to because of the riper grape that we used to have. So things have changed a little bit, but it is one of the things in a blind tasting that just remember that if it's tannic, it's not Pinot Noir, it's going to be the Nebbiola, and if it has those aromas, the rose and the leather and the licorice and the tobacco and the truffles, and it's very likely to be Nebbiola. Yeah, Ossobuco al Barolo. I had to put that photograph there because I made it once and I found it very, very difficult to pour half a bottle of Barolo into my stew with my veal shin, I have to say. So, but it is really very delicious. So if you've ever done it, and it is really quite delicious, it's just a very hard thing to do. I wouldn't do it with my cru Barolo though. Okay, so can we move on, please, Julia? Yeah, so we've got that one, and again, I quite just like that little map. But I've got there the communes and the finest vineyards now, which in those communes. And once again, like the map that we had from, you can get the same map of Barolo. So if you want to really get to know those vineyards well, then you can actually pick those up from that website and print them off. And you can obviously zoom in and you can really study them if it's something that you really want to do. It's really tough. It was a lot easier before they had these crew maps, I can tell you. It's now, I look at that and I just go, oh God. You know, it's taken me 20 years to learn most of the crew of Burgundy, but doing it all over again with Barolo, it's just like, oh dear, I'm too old. Okay, can we move on, please? So I just wanted to finish off with this argument, really, tradition versus modernism. And this is quite interesting because this has changed so much. When I first did this presentation, which was, I think, probably about 8-9 years ago, this was still very much a real thing. And yet it's no longer such a big thing, because what I was talking about from the beginning with those great varieties, with Nebbiola, sorry, and having to leave it to really show itself, leave it for years and years and years and years. And yet in the past, that was quite difficult to do because the grape didn't always ripen properly. So by the time it had actually integrated properly, there was very little flavor left. It's not really the case any longer. So just to give you some history, as things started to change and new winemakers came in and consumer tastes changed, I think this was one of the premium factors, is that consumers no longer wanted to buy wine and put it away for 20 years. We all want to go into a winery, into a shop, we want to order some wine, and we want to be able to drink it. And very few people now have cellars or places to store wine. So most people don't want to buy something and have to leave it for 20 years. We also changed our flavors, changed our taste, in that we started to prefer fruit to characteristics which came through after age. So if you ask most younger people, they like fruit. They all like fruit. And so the Barolo and Barbaresco producers had to accept to have fruit in their wines, they had to be drunk earlier. So before they took on the tar and roses, they had to be drunk earlier. So how can you actually get these wines to be drunk earlier? And one of those is to put them into a French barrique. So the barrique obviously softens the wine earlier. The other very obvious one is the short maceration period, and I've popped it on there, and cooler fermentation. The short maceration obviously means that you have got those thick tannic skins in contact with the juice for a lot shorter period. So there's less time for the wine to take on those tannins. But it also means it's less time for the wine to take on the flavor. But the argument I remember having with Elio Altare, this wine producer at the bottom, was, yes, but actually I don't need those flavors because people aren't going to be drinking my wine in 40 years. They're going to be drinking them in 10. So it was a bit of, it was like, okay, I can understand that. So he wanted the flavor there and then straight away. And this was the modernist reaction. A lot of young winemakers were doing it, and it was very, very successful. However, quite quickly we started to notice that what it did do is that just because tannins are ripe doesn't mean to say that it doesn't allow the wine to age. Ripe tannins, the wine will still age for 20, 30 years. And in fact, in 20 or 30 years' time, these modernist winemakers discovered that their wines were sublime. So it was a case of, okay, I liked my idea, but in fact, one of the things that those barrique does is it covers up the flavors. It covers up that tar and roses. And so do we really want it there? And what has actually happened over the last decade, the last 15 years, is people have stopped doing it. And you find that maybe even the modernist producers have become a little bit traditional. So they may be using 10 or 20% of their wine, putting it into barrique, and the rest they're putting it back in the old oak or chestnut botte, because they appreciate that actually even with a ripe grape, that French oak does cover up the aroma and the flavor of the Nebbiola. You also have the long maceration of the traditionalists. So these could be 20, 30, 40 days of macerations. It would take on a lot of tannin. And during that time, there's obviously a lot of extraction. And if the grape wasn't very, very ripe, you would end up with quite a lot of bitterness. And at the end of a long period of aging, that's what you get left with, unfortunately. So even the traditionalists have actually moved slightly the other way, and they've actually started to shorten their maceration times. So they've both kind of come both ways. And the traditionalists, there's a lot more green harvesting, a lot more de-leafing now, so that their grapes are riper when they're picked. So they don't need to have such long maceration times to release the right amount of tannin. So they've both kind of come around and met in the middle. And in fact, I think this is one of the most exciting times right now for Barolo and Barbaresco, because we have these modern winemakers who've really worked it out, and the wines are just, with that bit of global warming, which we obviously hate, but can be quite helpful, and work in the vineyard and changes in the winery, I think it's just bang on. I think they're just stunning. Julia, could you move on, please? Thank you. So there's a vintage chart for you. Like Julia said, this is going on to YouTube. You can screenshot it if you want. I don't know how. Oh yeah, you got it on. You sent it over, haven't you? Everybody's got it. I don't know. It doesn't matter. But like I said, vintage is quite important here because of the, if you get rain early in the autumn, it can stop the ripening of those Nebbiola vines. You can see there that I've cut out 2002 and 2003, but just to fill you in, 2002 was a disaster. It rained so much, it actually washed away some vineyards, properly washed away some vineyards. So it was a disaster. 2003 was very hot, and although they drink up now. If some of the top wines maybe still last, but they definitely have a slightly cooked kind of character to them. And I tasted one a couple of years ago. Definitely, I think in general the threes should be drinking up now. But other than that, because we've had some very good weather in Piemonte, they are seriously lovely vintages. 2000, the last three, 15, 16, 17, 18 and 19, we're not really talking about yet because it's too early to say how they're going to show. But 15, 16 and 17, bang on. 16, I've never been to a Nebbiola tasting or a Piemontese tasting and not had somebody say, yes, but. 16, nobody said but. Everybody just said, perfect. It's perfect. Perfect. There was no, yes, but, if you came from that part there, they weren't quite as good. Or if you went from that part there, they're just a little bit over extracted, a bit cooked. Nothing. It was just, everybody just had fabulous things to say. So if I was going to make an investment, or if I was going to, and that applies to those wines from outside Barolo and Barbaresco, Langhe, Roero, Alba, Gattinara, any of those, 15, 16 and 17 will just be seriously good, but 16 especially, they're really good. Okay, I think I've talked myself stupid now, so oh, Julia, that's an O at the end of my name. I don't know if that's changeable.
Sorry, no, typo. Apologies, everyone. Don't make my mistake. You can see Nina's name on the screen there. Sorry about that.
That's all right. It's not very interesting anyway.
Well, first off, thanks for that. What an epic tour through Piemonte. So interesting to find out about the new things that are happening, the different styles, and I'm sure there's a lot for people to get their teeth into there. I imagine we're going to have some questions, so I think if anyone who wants to ask a question can just try and either type it in or use the raised hand function on Zoom. That way I'll just be able to manage it a bit better. Otherwise we're going to have everyone talking at once and it might be a bit much. So yeah, if anyone has anything that they want to ask, now is the time. In fact, I'll stop the recording here and we can just carry on having a chat.